This is a video about CSS specificity. Specificity in CSS is probably one of the most complicated pieces of the language. It's also the piece that people misunderstand the most. With it, CSS is an easy language to learn. It only takes a few minutes, but to really master the language, you have to understand specificity as well as the selectors and how CSS works. And that takes many, many years. So each CSS selector has different levels of importance in specificity, which compete against other selectors, which gets really complicated when you look at how CSS renders and how they battle against each other. So in this video, by the end of it, you should have a base understanding of what CSS specificity is and how you can write better code. In addition to this video, I'm going to be doing other videos that are about CSS specificity, which will be things like IT CSS or inverted triangle, which is a methodology about how to align your CSS and make sure that you don't have what they refer to as CSS specificity wars. So that'll be in a later video. This is just an introduction to specificity and also cover some base things about what CSS is as a language. So to get started, I have a CodePen, and I use CodePen for demo purposes. It's also really nice if I want to just put something together. I don't want to spin up a project locally. I highly recommend signing up for CodePen, having a CodePen account, and utilizing it, especially if you're trying to learn. So I have it just set up for HTML and CSS. So over here is HTML and this one's CSS. To get started in this, I'm just going to add an H1 or a header, and I'm just going to write hello world inside here. Oops. And on my CSS, I'm going to add a selector. So I'm going to use a type selector, which a type selector is a CSS selector that aligns to the DOM element. So in the case of the DOM element, it's H1, and my type selector for that would be an H1. In CSS, you use curly brackets, and inside those curly brackets, you write your CSS properties, which are all the stylistic pieces of the code that you're writing. So the first part of it, I'll make this red. So I'll use color, which is a CSS property, and then I put a colon, and then I add a value inside of it. The value for this will be red, and then I end it with a semicolon. So this is a CSS selector of H1 with the CSS property of color with a value of red. And this CSS selector is aligning to this HTML element of H1, and that's why we have the hello world being written in red. Other things to know, if I do something like body at the top, and I type in body, and right now the default from the browser is a serif font, and that's pretty common in all browsers. If I want to override that, I can write font family and put something like sans serif or any font that I have installed on my computer, or any web friendly font, or using a Google font. But for this demo, I'm just using sans serif, and you'll notice that the hello world is now a sans serif font. So how this works, this isn't about specificity, but it's kind of related. It's inheritance. So CSS has two main aspects, and it's inheritance as well as specificity. And the more you write CSS, the more you'll get used to what is being inherited and what doesn't get inherited, and then how specificity actually combats and works with each other. So as you can see here, the H1 that has hello world in it has now become sans serif because it's inheriting the font family. So a lot of all the font pieces, so anything dealing with typography, so font family, font weight, the font size, are actually inheriting down from a parent DOM element. Now I am in CodePen, so you don't see the body element, but it's actually being displayed here. And the body element is one of the it's a core, I guess, node inside the DOM. So it's one of the main children of the HTML root. And inside there, the body is a parent of the H1. So the H1 is inheriting the font family. The same way could also happen with a color. So right now, and before I get into the color example, I'll show you the inheritance. So I'm using Chrome. If you right click and go to inspect, which will bring up the Chrome developer tools. And then off to here in the bottom, you will see that it has this code down here. So this is actually looking at my HTML code and the CSS that I've written. So I highlight this H1 and you can see that it has the H1 kind of being, you can see the H1 being highlighted with that CSS property that I wrote that's up there. But then you can also see that it has this H1 element. So every element in HTML has built-in CSS properties, and those come from the user agent. So those are tagged right here in Chrome Developer Tools as user agent, meaning that those are built into the browser. I don't have to write the code for it. But this can get into problems if you're using the wrong element, and it can also, you know, if I switch this out to an H2, you'll notice that this will go from a font size 2M to a 1 point, oops, to a 1.5M. So certain things change when you change out the element itself. But I'm going to go back to the H1 and continue to explain how the user agent works. So again, we have this, hello world. On the H1, we have the user agent, and these are all built into that HTML element, and that comes from the actual spec from the W3C org. And inside here, color is part of this style sheet that's written up here, so it's separated out. I don't know how well this comes across, but it's kind of gray for the user agent inside there. Now, as I was saying earlier, inherited by also comes up in the Chrome Developer Tools. So you can see the font family, sans serif, is actually being inherited from body, which was defined here. So in this one element, there's a lot actually going on. We've defined it as red with the CSS property color, with the value red, with this H1 type selector, which is aligned to this element. And then we have body, which is a parent above this. And on body, we've used the body type selector, and we've done the font family CSS property with the value sans serif to override the default user agent. And if I look at this, that is how we get into this H1 being color red, bringing in the user agent of this for the sizing and everything, and then the sans serif being here. Now if I were to add a paragraph here, and let's just throw this in here. The paragraph is black, and why it's black is because we have not defined anything to do anything to add any CSS properties. It is just purely inheriting it from the body, so that's why it's sans serif, and then it's getting computed from the user agent, and then we can look at additional pieces from the actual browser by clicking this right next to it, oops, paragraph, and then going to computed, and then you can see all the properties that are actually being defined inside of it. So these are the overrides of it. If I were to click show all, you can see every CSS property that's actually applicable to that HTML element, which is very, very helpful, especially when you're getting into debugging or if you're getting results that you don't want. So that's a quick thing on inheritance as well as Chrome Developer Tools. They're very handy when writing your CSS. I use them daily, and I've been writing CSS since it came out in '96. So back into what specificity is. So here we have this H1. This has very low specificity. It is just a type selector. And with that, we are looking at a single selector that is adding these properties. Now, as I said earlier, if I define something from the parent, it inherits to the child. So if I add in the color, let's do purple. That may be hard to see, but this is now purple. So paragraph has now become purple. So I'm going to change that to blue. It'll be a little bit more noticeable. So now the paragraph is blue, but this is still red. So the colors and fonts are being inherited down from the body, which is in the parent element above the paragraph tag, and that's why it's being inherited down. But this H1 is remaining as red because I have an override for it, which is happening right here. So again, if we look at this and inspect it, we will see that this has the defined color of red. We look at the user agent, it's still there. But then you can also see that it has inherited from body, where it says font family is sans serif. That's why it's that font family. But the color has a slash through it. And what that slash means is we're overriding that CSS property by this color that's here. So The one kind of general rule that I have for writing CSS is I don't like to see slashes in my code. So that gets into some of the demos that I'll do with specificity. You do not want to see these. The only time where you want to see slashes is based off inheritance as well as from the user agent. So those are the two real great use cases. You do have to use them here and there, especially if you're namespacing or you have to have an override for a modifier. They're great in those cases. But if you're writing something from the beginning, try to eliminate the slashes, especially for code that you just wrote. So really the slashes should just be reserved for overridings, which are slashes in Chrome Developer Tools, for inheritance as well as from the user agent. Now, CSS also reads from top to bottom. So if I were to add another H1, so this is just adding another type selector that is the same up here, and I defined it as color. I'm really forgetting colors right now. We'll go back to purple. And so now this has become purple. The reason why this is purple is we see the slash here, and we're overriding the CSS property with the same property at a later time. Now, you would say that this wouldn't ever happen, and it probably shouldn't happen this closely together, but if you're writing CSS and it's thousands of lines of code, this use case actually happens all the time. And here's that slash. This is one of the ones that we want to avoid because this is actually coming from our CSS. This just means we've done really poor code. Now, to also show you how CSS renders is based off the order of the elements. So if I change the order of this, the H1 that was once below, and move it above this one, it has now become red. And that's because CSS reads from top to bottom, and we go this way. Now it reads top to bottom, but it also takes into account specificity. The higher the specificity usually means one of two things. The CSS selector actually has built-in higher specificity from it. These are things like IDs can win over, or the selector itself has multiple selectors to build out the actual, I guess, querying of it in the DOM. So, other thing to show you, if I move the body, and I put it after here, this guy is still being overwritten because it's actually in the, this is actually getting overwritten because of the DOM order inside here. So this is still, even though I was talking about inheritance, this has higher specificity, and this is why it's actually winning on top of it. So these are kind of the initial pieces of this. So let's go back here. We put the body here. It doesn't change it to blue because this is actually higher in the DOM, and the order of this is all based off of, these are equal specificity, and that's why it's switching. But then this is also bringing into account how the DOM actually works inside there. So this is overriding the inheritance of it, and that's why that's happening. All right, so we're going to put this back up here, and then I'm going to show you a base example of specificity. So again, here we have this H1 that's red. It's being overwritten by this purple because it's coming afterwards. Now, if I wanted this red to win, I could increase the specificity by saying something like body H1, and now it's become red. So how you read CSS is kind of backwards. You say the red color the red color is applied to an H1 element that's inside of a body. So what this is looking at is the DOM structure of the body and then an H1 inside of it. So it has higher specificity because it has higher definition of how you're declaring these CSS properties. Now if I put this in a different order, it doesn't matter because specificity is going to win, not just based off the order. So the goal of writing CSS is to write far-reaching selectors at the top and having more specificity as you get down to the bottom of your code. So in this example, it is coming up in why the color red is winning, even though it is above the color purple, is because it has higher specificity. Now these are pretty basic examples, and I'm going to move away from type selectors because we shouldn't be using those in general. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create something called like color accent, actually color primary. My keyboard's broken, so I'm going to make this CSS class that's called color primary, and then I'm going to create color secondary, and I can't type today, and make this be blue. And then I'm going to create something that's called like title, and I'm going to give it a font family, sans serif, and I'm going to give it a text transform of uppercase. So I'm going to apply the CSS classes to it. So how I add CSS classes is I use a class attribute on the element and align it here. So right now we are getting the color blue inherited from here as well as sans serif, but I'm going to remove those, and especially because we can't see body in CodePen, it makes it a little bit confusing. So I'm going to add the class to make this red, and I'm going to say color dash primary. So that's my CSS selector, and now it's red here. And the cool thing about this is if I have an H2 and I say hello Kevin, and then I give it a class color secondary. Now this is able to be the secondary color, but if I wanted them both to be red, they can both be red. So I'm not applying it to one selector, one DOM element. So that's why you don't want to use the type selectors. It limits on which elements you can do, and align yourself to better selectors that are a little bit more scalable. And then I'm also going to add in the title inside here. So now they're both uppercase and align here. I can then create some additional pieces here. And we'll call this one secondary. And now these two are the same, but they have different styles. So that's just how CSS works, and that's very, very intro on how this is set up. But I'm going to put these all inside of a section. And imagine that this was a better design. Okay. And I'm going to give this a class that's called section block. For section block, actually, let's do this. Let's do a type selector, just say all sections. Again, shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to add a border of 1 pixel and make it solid. Another thing I'm going to do is use the star selector and just say box sizing, border box, and all sections are going to have a padding of 20 pixels inside here. So now we have this lovely design here. And then the last thing is I'm going to write a selector that says section, which is the CSS selector, and I'll explain what this does. So this is saying a margin top property with the value of 20 pixels. If there's a section that's directly next to another section, then apply this guy inside here. So that's why there's spaces in between there. That's more just for demo and purposes of looking at this, so it's not so hard to read. Now, getting back into specificity, what I could then do is, right here we have this section. Inside section block, instead of it having 20 pixels, I can add padding and make it be 40 pixels. So you can see that this one has 40 pixels inside here versus this. So why that's happening is because the class has higher specificity built into it than the type selector. It's also afterwards, but if I were to change the order of this, it would still work the exact same way. Now, with this, that's overriding the actual element that's there, and that's on the type selector. But if I wanted to add specificity just to this one, what I could do is say all this, and oops, what I'm going to do is I'm going to override what primary is for the section block. And I'm going to say color, which is a darker red inside here. So what this is saying is for every color primary that's inside of a section block, make it be this darker red color, and that's why that's happening. So why this is happening is this has higher specificity, it's a longer selector, and it has this helper class right here, the section block, which is then applying that and overriding what that guy is, which is this color. So color primary is being overwritten because it is inside here. And that's how specificity works. Cool. And for this, let's do that example that I had now that we have more code. So say I was like, I want color primary to be lime. And I put it in here. Why it's not actually going to that lime color, even if I move it after this primary, is because down here, later in the CSS, the color primary is being overwritten here. Now, if I wanted this lime to still win, I could add additional specificity to it. So I could add something like this, section.section block, color primary, and now it's going to be lime. So if I were to do this, say, we see that this guy has the padding, but it's still blue because it's using this, because this is only applying to the color primary. Now, if I wanted them both to be that color, I could say section and say secondary, which is defined as blue up above, is now that color. So I'm using specificity to override those two values inside here by adding additional selectors inside there. So longer selector, the higher the specificity. Now, this is really awful code, so if I were to look at what this is, you'll see that this has a history of overriding. So we have the user agent, which is fine, and then we have the color secondary, which is just a simple selector class, and then we have, and I can't believe I didn't realize that, should be font family, not family. But we have the color blue, and then we have the section block, or the color secondary, being defined as lime inside here, which has a higher specificity, and that's why it's winning on top of it. Another thing you can also do is you can look at the computed, and you can highlight the CSS property that you want, and you can expand it out, and it'll show you the lines that it actually goes to. And I can click on that, and it'll highlight where it is. And then I can also look at where all the overriding history is, and click on that and see where it came from. So the CSS selectors inside there. If I really wanted to go crazy and I want to make all my fonts in here be, or all my colors be, say, I want them all to be purple. Now, what I could do here is use the star selector, which is the selector that's applied to every single element. So just to show you what that does, if I put outline, 1 pixel solid red, they all have a red outline. So every HTML element gets that. So if I'm like, I want to make this be color purple. Excuse me. If I want to make this be color purple, you can see that it's being applied to a lot of the properties, but these are still having all that, even though it's doing this. Now I could do something like this, which is saying every star inside the star gets applied this, still not having enough inside there. I could do this, and you would think that would work, and in some cases it does, but for what we need to do here is add additional specificity. So I'm going to use the root HTML selector, and then I'm going to say body, and I'm going to say star, and have this really long one that then overrides it. Oh, that's still not enough. And say section, Why is that winning? I will highlight that and see why that's happening. So this guy is still having higher specificity because the star selector is still seen as a type selector. So what we would need to do is apply that to another type of element inside here. The one thing that would also make this work is from the beginning is if I just did star and then I applied the never use case of important, and then that applies it to all elements and it overrides it no matter what the order is and wherever it is in your code. Important should never really be used. The only use cases for it are for utility classes that whenever this property is being used, you never want it to be overwritten. Where these become really painful is if we have two different importance, and then it gets back into the battles of specificity as well as order of CSS. So, anywho, this demo I could go on a lot more, but what's really important here is just to show how the longer the selector is, the higher the specificity. But then certain CSS properties actually have higher specificity. If you want to increase specificity, you add more selectors to it. There's various ways of doing that. I would not necessarily recommend going and increasing specificity. The proper way of doing CSS is to follow the patterns of object-oriented CSS and having the different properties and utilities being applied to it, similar to like how this was initially set up, where there's a title which gives it some format as well as the colors being applied to it, as opposed to writing really long selectors. But understanding here what's happening is how the CSS is being applied, as well as the order of it, some basic things on inheritance, but then also how these are actually being rendered in Chrome Developer Tools. So I hope that this was a demo that helps you understand what specificity is. There's a lot more to talk about, and really understanding the CSS selectors are what's really important. One of my favorite go-to resources for CSS selectors is this website that is called 30 Selectors You Must Memorize. So I always send this out to people when I'm teaching them about CSS. So it's one of the top hits here. It's a little bit dated, but this really is a great starting point for learning CSS and the various properties. And it also shows you the compatibility of them all the way back to IE6. But it's a fantastic site that defines all the primary CSS selectors that are out there and how these work. So showing like Y is inside X right here, some of the demos that we were showing, some of the pseudo classes, and even like the example that I gave earlier of the plus is inside here. So that guy right there. And if you're ever curious to know what CSS properties exist, go to caniuse.com. So something like color, which is going to be supported by input type color. It's not even showing this because this one's supported everywhere, but the basic CSS property. But something like flex is going to have a little bit more here. So you can see how the CSS property is being supported by all browsers. And this one needs a partial inside there. But then if we're going to look at grid, you can see that there's still really great support for it. Except for the older browsers, and the 10 and 11 kind of render it a little bit weird and funky. But this is a great resource. 30 selectors, how to that you should memorize. You should definitely know how to do this if you're writing CSS. It doesn't take too long, but just use the examples here, play with them in a code pen, and try them out. And from there, learn how to write CSS where you're not overwriting it, but really extending it, because that's the goal of CSS. So with that, this demo, if you have questions, reach out to me in the comments. You can also tweet at me. I'm Nicetransition on Twitter. I do respond kind of quickly. And if you make comments in the video, I literally get like a message on my phone, and I try to respond literally in a few minutes if I am able to. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me on YouTube or hitting me up on Twitter at Nicetransition. So that's that. Again, let me know how I can help. Thanks.